Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents This Pen for Hire by Laura Levine, narrated by Brittany Pressley.
Chapter 1. When I wrote that letter for Howard, I hoped it would get him a date. I never dreamed it would get him arrested for murder. I suppose I should tell you how Howard and I first met. I'd just stepped out of the shower one unseasonably warm February day when I heard a soft scratching at the front door, like a dog pawing to be let in. I slipped into my pink silk kimono and padded across the living room, fluffing my hair en route. I opened the door and saw that it was not a dog, but a human being, one of my clients, a first-timer. This one was a geeky guy with slicked-down hair and white socks, a veritable poster boy for pocket protectors. He stared down at my welcome mat, clearly embarrassed. "It's $50 an hour, right?" "That's right," I said. "I've never done anything like this before," he mumbled. "That's okay," I said, ushering him inside. "There's nothing to be ashamed of. Take off your jacket and relax." "No, I'm not a prostitute. I'm a writer. Which, in Los Angeles, is often the same thing. My name is Jaine Austen. My mother is an Anglophile and a bad speller. And I run a writing service out of my apartment called This Pen for Hire. Catchy, isn't it? I used to come up with catchy names all the time back when I worked in advertising, before I woke up one morning and decided I no longer wanted to spend the rest of my life writing stories that ended in the words, "void where prohibited by law." I write resumes, letters, brochures, and personal ads. Lots of personal ads. Maybe you've read my latest, Rap Papa Seeks Acrobatic Mama. I don't usually greet clients in a kimono, but Howard Murdoch was a full hour early for his appointment. He'd called me that morning, having read my ad in the Yellow Pages. He told me that he needed me to write a letter. I left him perched on the edge of a chair in the living room while I went to change into my official work clothes, elastic waist pants and a t-shirt. I came out from my bedroom to find him still precariously balanced at the edge of the chair. One stiff wind and he'd be history. "Come on," I said, leading him into my office suite, otherwise known as my dining room. "Have a seat," I said, gesturing to the dining table. Howard started for a chair, and I screeched in dismay, "Hey, don't sit on my Prozac!" I scooped my Prozac off the chair Howard was about to sit in and tossed her in the kitchen. She glared at me balefully, then got revenge by leaping on top of the dryer, onto a pile of freshly folded laundry. I turned to Howard and smiled my most encouraging smile. "So, you said over the phone that you wanted me to write a letter for you?" He blinked, as if hearing this news for the first time. "You did want me to write a letter, didn't you?" He picked at a scab on his knuckle. "That's right." "What kind of letter? A consumer complaint? The airlines lose your luggage? I get a lot of those." "No." He was staring down at my hardwood floors, avoiding my glance. "Look, Howard, I can't write a letter for you if you don't tell me what it's about." He mumbled something to one of the grooves in my hardwood floor. It sounded something like love letter. "What?" At last he looked up at me. "A love letter. I want you to write a love letter." The words, "You have a girlfriend?" shot out of my mouth before I could stop myself. "I mean, you have a girlfriend. How nice," I added quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed my momentary lack of couth. "Not exactly." "Oh? Is it a boyfriend? Nothing wrong with that, not at all." No, it's a girl. It's just that she's not my girlfriend. In fact, I've never actually spoken to her, but I know that I love her with all my heart and soul." "Oh, geez." I smiled woodenly. "My first stalker." "So, tell me, who is she, this love of yours?" He whipped out a ragged newspaper clipping from his wallet and thrust it at me.
"Her name," he said reverently, "is Stacy."
I looked down at a picture of a lethal blonde in a black leotard. The caption read, S. Lawrence named new sports club aerobics instructor.
"She teaches aerobics at my gym."
Guys are amazing, aren't they? You take your average geeky woman. Sure, she may fantasize about Tom Cruise, but does she actually expect to wind up dating him? Of course not. She knows she's going to wind up with a guy named Norm with love handles and hairy knuckles. Men, on the other hand, are totally delusional. I'll bet there are thousands of short, fat, bald guys convinced they could be dating Heather Locklear if only they knew her phone number. I looked down at the blonde in the clipping, with her hard-as-nails eyes, deep tan, and perfect body. Poor Howard didn't stand a chance. Look, Howard, I'm not so sure it's a wise idea to write a love letter to someone you don't even know.
It doesn't have to be a love letter exactly. I want you to write her something that will make her want to date me.
You want a miracle, I thought. Go to Lourdes. How about I write you a resume instead? You happy at your job? But he wasn't budging.
I want you to write a letter to Stacy.
Okay, I said, forcing a smile. Tell me a little about yourself. He stared at me blankly. What do you do for a living?
I'm an insurance adjuster.
Ouch. Not much excitement there. Hobbies?
I watch TV a lot.
That's it?
Well,
he said, obviously saving the best for last.
Mom and I collect chopsticks from Chinese restaurants.
I sighed deeply. I knew I had to turn the job down. It wouldn't be fair to take Howard's money for something I knew would never work out. If there's one thing I pride myself on, it's my integrity. Look, Howard, this isn't going to work.
I'll pay you triple your usual fee.
I reached for my pad and pen. Is that Stacy with a Y or an IE? Chapter 2. Okay, so I was a little low on integrity that week. I had bills to pay and a costly Frappuccino habit to support. It's not cheap living in Beverly Hills, not even when you live like I do, on the wrong side of the tracks, south of Wilshire Boulevard. Wilshire is the dividing line in Beverly Hills. North of Wilshire, you're rich. South of Wilshire, you're not. And I'm south of Wilshire. So south, I'm practically in Mexico. I live on a quiet, tree-lined street dotted with duplexes. I've got a one-bedroom apartment with a working fireplace, hardwood floors, and an enviable location just up the street from a Starbucks. On the downside, there's the rent, high, the traffic, often impossible, and my neighbor, Lance Venable, always impossible. Lance lives next to me in the front unit of our duplex, a natty dresser with a head full of tight blonde curls. Lance works at Neiman Marcus, selling ladies' shoes. I guess when you spend your days cramming bunions into Ferragamos, you're bound to be a bit cranky. The trouble with Lance is he's got Superman-quality hearing. The man hears sounds even dogs can't hear. Someone flushes the toilet in Pomona, and Lance hears it. Needless to say, Lance hears just about everything I do in my apartment. He hears my phone. He hears my hairdryer. He claims he can hear Prozac meowing to be fed. The only thing he doesn't hear are the sounds of me having sex in the bedroom. Mainly because there aren't any. But that's a whole other story. One I'd be glad to tell you about if I weren't already in the middle of telling you about Howard, the lovesick goofball. When Howard left my apartment that afternoon, I knew I was into deep Mission Impossible territory. I noodled around on my computer for a while, trying to think what I could possibly write that would lure Stacy out on a date with Howard. The best I could come up with was, "Dear Stacy, if you go out with me, I'll give you $1 million. Yours sincerely, Howard Murdoch." And frankly, I wasn't even sure that would work. After an hour or two of intense thought, and 17 trips to the refrigerator to see if anything interesting had shown up since the last time I looked, I came up with exactly nothing. So I put Howard's file aside and went back to work on a resume I'd been writing for a recent college graduate who'd majored in parties and was now trying to give the impression that he'd actually attended some of his classes. It wasn't easy, but it was a damn sight easier than Howard. At about 6 o'clock, I was interrupted by Prozac, wailing for her dinner. Poor darling hadn't eaten for at least an hour. I know I shouldn't give in to her constant demands for food, and every day I vow I'm going to limit her intake to just 5 meals a day. But I always end up giving in, after just a few pitiful meows. After feeding Prozac her savory mackerel feast, I hurried into the shower. I had a dinner date that night, and I wanted to look good. I was in the middle of blow-drying my hair, trying to torture my natural curls into a sleek Jennifer Aniston do, when Lance started banging on the wall. "Keep it down in there!" I gritted my teeth and turned the dryer down to low, wondering if I could possibly afford a hitman to puncture Lance's eardrums. I got myself all gussied up in a pair of Ann Taylor slacks, J. Crew sweater, and Kmart control-top pantyhose. I checked myself out in the mirror and saw that my freshly straightened hair was already beginning to frizz. In less than 10 minutes, I'd gone from Jennifer Aniston to Shirley Temple. Just the look I was aiming for, a 36-year-old moppet. Oh well, there was nothing I could do. If I didn't hurry, I'd be late for my date. I grabbed my purse and bent down to kiss Prozac goodbye. She licked my neck hungrily, no doubt searching for cat food hidden behind my ears. Then I headed out the door with a spring in my step, a curl in my hair, and mackerel-scented saliva on my neck. I walked into the trendy restaurant on Melrose. You know the kind of place where all the waiters are actors and the pesto flows like water. I looked around the room. A handsome guy in a black turtleneck sweater and wire-rimmed glasses waved from his table. Unfortunately, he wasn't waving at me, but at the stunning redhead behind me. I headed over to where Candy was sitting, waiting for me. Candy Tobolowsky is an ex-New Yorker with enviably straight hair and a great sense of humor, which comes in handy when you're saddled with a name like Candy Tobolowsky. I guess you could say Candy is my best friend. We met 5 years ago at a UCLA screenwriting class. I'd just been through a messy divorce, are there any other kind, and was looking for a way to stretch my creative muscles. Oh, who am I kidding? I was looking for a way to get out of my apartment one night a week. Candy had just moved out to LA from New York, determined to make it in showbiz. I've always been drawn to New Yorkers. I like their edge, their impatience, their chutzpah. Most of all, I like the fact that they never tell me to have a nice day. So when I saw Candy in class that first night of the summer session, tapping her feet impatiently and muttering, "Geez, it's like a sauna in here," I plopped down next to her. Our instructor was a bloated man with a greasy ponytail who spent most of the semester trashing our scripts and flirting with a sexy blonde in the first row. Not that I blamed him for flirting. The blonde was one heck of a good-looking guy. One night, the instructor was energetically trashing some poor schnook's script, something the schnook had clearly been writing and rewriting for most of his adult life. Candy, glaring at the instructor with disgust, scribbled a note and handed it to me. It said, "Kel asshole." I knew then that Candy was best friend material. I made my way across the crowded restaurant and joined Candy at a prized table she'd staked out by the window. She jumped up and hugged me happily. "Guess what, honey? I've met Mr. Right." That's the crazy thing about Candy. You'd think, coming from the mean streets of New York, she'd know the score about men. You'd think she'd have figured out by now that guys are like parking spaces. All the good ones are taken. But no, each time Candy meets a new man, she's convinced she's met Mr. Right. "Didn't you just meet Mr. Right last month?" I asked. The crazy dentist who took you out for dinner at the beach and then threatened to throw you off the Santa Monica Pier. That's ancient history. Wait till you see this one. He's perfect. Just look at his fact sheet. Candy belongs to Photo Date, one of those dating services that hands out fact sheets on prospective dates, listing all their vital statistics, none of which are verified, what they're looking for in a woman, Michelle Pfeiffer, and how they like to spend their free time. Forget romantic dinners and moonlight strolls on the beach. What they really want is nonstop sex and dinner at your place. I glanced down at the fact sheet. See, he's a doctor in Beverly Hills. And look at his picture. Doesn't he look just like Antonio Banderas? I blinked in disbelief. Good heavens, he did look just like Antonio Banderas. He sounds too good to be true, doesn't he? That should be a warning, Candy. Oh, don't be such a worrywart. He's taking me to dinner, to a seafood place, right on the beach. Better bring a life vest. If I sound cynical, it's because I am. 3 years with the Blob can do that to a gal. I call my ex-husband the Blob, and that's one of my more charitable nicknames. I met the Blob at a coffee house in Santa Monica. He was writing the great American novel, with his dark, brooding eyes straight out of an El Greco painting. I thought he was the sensitive artist of my dreams. So, throwing caution and my vibrator to the wind, I married the guy. Actually, our marriage was great. It was the living together afterward that sucked. His great American novel turned out to be more like the great American paragraph. True, he spent endless hours at the computer. Most of them I was eventually to discover on the Hot Babes in Thong Underwear website. After a while, he abandoned his novel and retired to the sofa where he proceeded to grow roots. When we finally divorced, I had to have the TV remote surgically removed from the palm of his hand. I'm starved, said Candy, scarfing down the last of the focaccia bread. We looked around for our waiter and spotted him fawning over people clearly more important than us. Candy finally managed to catch his eye. "Oh, actor," she called out. "We'd like some menus, please." "Great," I groaned. "Now he's going to spit in our food." "Don't be silly. They like it when you kid around." Our waiter, a pretty young man with eyelashes to die for, stomped over to our table and hurled some menus in our general direction. "Yeah, right, he's crazy about us." Candy waved away my sarcasm with a breadstick. "Honey," she said, "I've got fabulous news. Skip said he'd take a meeting with you, so think up some ideas for the cockroach." In the 5 years since our UCLA course, Candy had landed a job as a staff writer on Beanie and the Cockroach, a Saturday morning cartoon show about a short-order cook named Beanie who has a pet cockroach named Fred. I'm sorry, Candy, but if I live to be 100, I won't have story ideas for a cockroach. It's easy, come on, we'll brainstorm. She swiped a piece of focaccia from a passing busboy and chewed it thoughtfully. I know. What if the cockroach starts dating a termite, and his mother is furious at him for dating out of his species? Or what if Beanie takes the cockroach with him on a fancy catering job, and hijinks ensue when the snooty guests find bread on the salmon mousse? I smiled woodenly. Compared to the cockroach, writing that letter for Howard suddenly didn't seem so bad. Chapter 3. Dear Stacy, my name is Howard, and I'm one of the regulars in your step aerobics class. Although we've never actually spoken, for the past several months I've admired you from afar. And so I'm writing to ask you out on a date. I'm sure that a woman as beautiful as you probably has dozens of admirers, and I also realize that you don't even know me, but as my Uncle Rupert always says, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Your not-so-secret admirer, Howard Murdoch. But I don't have an Uncle Rupert. Howard sat across from me at my dining room table, tapping his foot in a nervous staccato on my hardwood floor. I couldn't help noticing that his fingernails were bitten to oblivion. Look, Howard, I said as gently as I could. Let's face facts. Under ordinary circumstances, Stacy might not go out with you. After all, she's a very beautiful woman, and like I said in the letter, she's bound to have all sorts of guys vying for her attention. Translation, she'd turn you down so fast your pens would be spinning in your pocket protector. But if she thinks you're related to Rupert Murdoch, you might stand a chance. Howard blinked, puzzled.
Who's Rupert Murdoch?
Good Lord, what planet was this guy from, anyway? Only one of the richest men in the world?
But Stacy isn't the kind of girl who'd go out with a guy just because he's rich.
Right, and Oreos aren't fattening.
Besides, if I say he's my uncle, isn't that lying?
Prozac looked up from where she was napping on the dining table and shot me a look, as if to say, is this guy for real? Or maybe she was saying, when do we eat? With cats, it's hard to tell. I prefer to think of it as a means to an end, I said.
Won't she be mad when she finds out I'm not really Rupert Murdoch's nephew?
You can only hope by the time she learns the truth, she will have fallen in love with you.
Gee, I don't know,
said Howard, chewing on his lower lip.
Isn't there any other way to get her to go out with me?
Other than taking her hostage, I don't think so. Poor Howard. He was so damned innocent, with his bulging brown eyes and polyester pants. If he wanted Stacy, he was going to have to lie. After all, we were in a town where lying is a way of life, and the truth is as rare as wrinkles in Malibu. Howard looked at me with trusting eyes.
If you think it'll work.
I do, I said, and much to my surprise, it did. 3 days later, Howard phoned me, barely able to contain his excitement.
Stacy said yes. We're going out tonight. Can you believe it?
Actually, I couldn't. That's wonderful, Howard.
How can I thank you? Do you realize this will be the first time in my life I've ever had a date on Valentine's Day? Usually I just go to the movies with Mom.
Good Lord. Just when you think no one could possibly be any more pathetic than you, someone comes along and out-pathetics you. I wished Howard the best of luck with Stacy and got off the phone. If I didn't hurry, I'd be late for my own Valentine's date. Surprised you, didn't I? Bet you thought I'd be sitting home alone with soup for one. Well, you're wrong. I gussied myself up and headed out the door for my hot date, with 12 senior citizens at the Shalom Retirement Home. I volunteer once a week at the Shalom Retirement Home, teaching a memoir writing class for seniors. It's just my way of contributing to the community and helping the elderly add a little meaning to their lives. Okay, it's my way of getting out of my apartment one night a week. When I first signed up for the gig, I thought I'd be hearing wonderful, Stones for Ibarra-ish memoirs, exciting adventures, touching tales of meaningful relationships and atmosphere-soaked descriptions of life at the beginning of the century. Instead, I got wooden travelogues about my trip to Israel or equally let-in tributes to my son, the orthodontist. It's funny. Women of my generation will bare their souls to perfect strangers at the drop of an hors d'oeuvre, will complain about our parents, our lovers, our vaginal dryness. But the ladies of that generation, and most of my students are ladies, wouldn't dream of sharing anything negative about their private lives with the outside world. In my class, all the parents are loving, all the children are devoted, and all the dead husbands are up for sainthood. In spite of their less than stirring memoirs, I'm really quite fond of these ladies. At 70 and 80-something, when many of their peers are sitting slack-jawed in front of Jerry Springer, they're taking out their pens and putting something down on paper each week. Not easy at any age. I don't care if they don't share their innermost thoughts. I care that they show up at my class each week, still taking a whack at life. I want to be like them when I grow up. I got in my Corolla that Valentine's Day and headed east on Pico Boulevard. Traffic was a nightmare. Pedestrians were making better time than I was. The roads were clogged with gooey-eyed Valentine's couples on their way to dinner, giggling and flirting and necking at red lights. I hope they all caught gum diseases. Disgusted with the traffic on Pico, I ducked onto a side street, where I whizzed along if your definition of whizzing is stopping for 19 stop signs. I finally pulled into the parking lot of the Shalom Retirement Home, a one-time apartment building now chopped up into 1- and 2-room retirement suites. I hurried into the conference room to find my students already seated, talking among themselves, complaining about the chicken at dinner, dry and tasteless and such small portions. A few of them eschewed food criticism to scribble last-minute changes on their essays. "Sorry I'm late, folks." "That's okay, sweetie." Mr. Goldman, the lone man in my class, winked at me. At least, I think it was a week. Mr. Goldman has a nervous tic, so I can never quite tell when he's winking or blinking. As I sprinted over to my seat, I noticed an apple at the head of the conference table. "For you, doll." Mr. Goldman grinned broadly, exposing an impressive set of dentures. Mrs. Pector, a soft, powdery lady with bosoms the size of throw pillows, shook her head in disgust. Of the dozens of women in the Shalom Retirement Home, Mr. Goldman had set his sights on a woman 48 years his junior, me. He was surrounded by women his own age and background, women he actually had something in common with, but no, he wanted someone young enough to be his granddaughter. A common Los Angeles malady, technically known as the Michael Douglas syndrome. "I polished it myself," he boasted, eyeing the apple proudly. "Yeah," added Mrs. Pector, "with his sweater." I glanced at Mr. Goldman's gravy-stained cardigan and smiled weakly. "Thank you, Mr. Goldman," I said, then turned to the others. "Okay, who wants to read first this week?" I glanced at Mrs. Vincenzo, hoping she'd volunteer. A slender woman with a dancer's body and long, silken hair that she wore swept up on the crown of her head in a wobbly bun. Betty Vincenzo was the talent of the class. She was a rabbi's daughter who'd rebelled against her Orthodox upbringing by marrying a Catholic fireman. She told the stories of her life, if not always grammatically, with refreshing candor. Unlike the other ladies, she never worried about keeping up appearances when writing about her many marriages, 4 so far, her offbeat jobs, and her fondness for tequila. I eyed her hopefully, and sure enough, she whipped out a story, written boldly on loose-leaf paper with turquoise marker. "When I was 64, she began, "I got a job as a ticket taker in a porno movie house." What a dame! I was 36, but compared to her, I felt 86. One of these days, as Mrs. Pector was fond of saying, I really was going to have a life. After Mrs. Vincenzo finished her tale of life in the porno biz, Mrs. Rubin read about her trip to the Orient, paid for by her son, the doctor, and Mrs. Zoller regaled us with tales of the late Mr. Zoller's charitable activities. Finally, I could ignore it no longer, Mr. Goldman's eager hand waving to be recognized. "Okay, Mr. Goldman, why don't you read us what you've written?" He took out a depressingly thick wad of pages from his notebook and began reading the latest installment in his epic saga, My Life as a Carpet Salesman. In the story of his life, Mr. Goldman spared us no details. We heard about the ups, the downs, the good and the bad. Area rugs, fech. Like Mrs. Vincenzo, Mr. Goldman had no qualms about sharing the intimate moments of his life. Somewhere in every story, he wrote about what an exciting lover he'd been, always looking up from his pages to wink/blink at me. Now Mr. Goldman was rambling on about the advent of broadloom. I looked around the table. Mrs. Pector was nodding off already, not 2 paragraphs into his tale. As Mr. G thrilled us with the pros and cons of Scotch guarding, my mind started to wander. I thought of Mrs. Vincenzo and her life filled with lovers. What was wrong with me anyway? Why couldn't I at least try to meet men? My last Valentine's date had been more than 4 years ago, with the Blob, if you can call it a date. He bought me a 5-pound box of chocolates, ate it while I was getting dressed to go out for dinner, and then spent the rest of the night puking in the toilet bowl. At last, Mr. Goldman ground to a halt. The ladies nudged each other awake, and we adjourned for the evening. Mr. Goldman asked me if I'd like to join him for a moonlight stroll around the parking lot.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?